The Pimlico Mystery, Adelaide Bartlett and the Chloroform Enigma. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. This manuscript follows the Adelaide Bartlett case as a sequence of actions, decisions, and documented statements, rather than as a morality play. Where the record is incomplete or contradictory, the uncertainty is preserved. Where the evidence supports multiple interpretations, those interpretations are kept in view without forcing a solution that the sources cannot sustain. The Bartlett case endures because it sits at a fault line in late Victorian criminal investigation. The era had chemists who could identify poisons, coroners who could convene public inquiry, and courts that demanded proof beyond suspicion. It also had limits. Forensic science was uneven, laboratory methods varied between practitioners, and the legal system often leaned on inference when method could not be established. In the Bartlett case, method was not a detail. It was the center of gravity. At its simplest, the case appears straightforward. Thomas Edwin Bartlett, a prosperous London grocer, dies after illness. His body is examined, poison is detected, suspicion follows. But almost immediately the story refuses to behave like an ordinary poisoning. Chloroform is found in the stomach in quantity sufficient to kill. Yet the expected path of administration is missing. The tissues of the mouth and throat do not show the damage normally associated with swallowing such a substance. That contradiction turns a domestic death into a technical problem. And when a technical problem cannot be settled cleanly, attention shifts toward the human environment around it. Who had access, who controlled care, who bought what, who spoke to whom, who benefited from silence, and who was vulnerable to scandal. This is also a case about privacy. The Bartlett marriage operated behind closed doors in a way that did not match conventional Victorian expectation. There were no children. By Adelaide's later account, sexual relations ceased early and permanently. The household ran on respectability and control, but its internal arrangement was unusual. That unusual arrangement mattered because, once Edwin died, it became an explanation many people were eager to use. In Victorian England, perceived sexual impropriety could supply motive in the public mind even where the law required something firmer. The investigation and the trial unfolded in the space between those two standards. The narrative keeps a deliberate focus on logistics. Murder, when it occurs, is rarely performed in a single dramatic moment. It is more often made possible by routine, repeated visits, trusted roles, familiar bottles, ordinary remedies, predictable patterns of entry and exit. The Bartlett case, whether one believes it involved murder or not, is inseparable from routine. It is a story of sickroom control, of who was present when decisions were made, of how supplies moved through a household, and of how a rented room in Pimlico reduced the number of witnesses who could later speak with certainty about what happened inside it. This manuscript uses contemporary place names and titles as they appear in the historical record. It does not attempt to modernize Victorian attitudes, it reports them as conditions that shaped the case. It does not soften the role of the press, it treats Victorian newspaper culture as an active force that influenced reputations, pressured witnesses, and helped determine which facts were repeated until they felt inevitable. It also does not treat court proceedings as neutral theater. Trials are designed to persuade. Evidence is introduced with intent. Questions are asked to produce an effect as much as an answer. The Bartlett trial at the Old Bailey is remembered partly because it exposes this machinery, the collision of expert disagreement, moral insinuation, and the strict standard of proof that can turn uncertainty into acquittal. The aim here is cohesion. Adelaide Bartlett is not treated as a symbol or a riddle in a dress. She is treated as a person moving through a set of constraints, illegitimacy and social ambiguity in youth, a marriage that offered security but carried its own private rules, and a public crisis that transformed private choices into public suspicion. Edwin Bartlett is not treated as a cardboard victim. He is a man whose prosperity, devotion, and illness shaped the household dynamics that followed. George Dyson is not treated as a stock villain or lover. He is treated as a figure of access, a minister and tutor whose closeness to Adelaide became both a scandal in the newspapers and a practical question for investigators. The servants, doctors, chemists, police and coroner are treated not as background but as the machinery through which the case became legible to the world. The record does not offer a clean ending. Even the verdict does not settle the story in the way modern true crime audiences often expect. A jury can decide only whether guilt has been proved to the legal standard. It cannot convert scientific uncertainty into certainty by force of will. In the Bartlett case, that uncertainty is not a failure of narrative. It is part of the truth of the period. The question the case leaves behind is not only who did it, but what could be proved, and what could not, in 1886. That is one reason the case remains useful to historians of law and medicine. It is also one reason it remains compelling as true crime, because it shows how easily a human life can be caught between suspicion and proof. What follows begins before the chloroform, before the inquest and the Old Bailey. It begins where Adelaide's position begins, in partial records, social ambiguity, and the disciplined management of identity. It moves forward through the marriage, the illness, the shift in household power, and the narrowing corridor of the final days. It then follows the case as it becomes public property, first in the inquest room, then in the court, then in the long afterlife of speculation. Prologue: The lodgings at Claverton Street. The room at 85, Claverton Street did not belong to the Bartletts. It was hired, furnished, and temporary, made for people who needed a place to sleep and leave behind. On the morning of January 1st, 1886, it held a sick man, the woman who had been organizing his care, and the quiet accumulation of ordinary objects that would soon be treated as possible instruments. Edwin Bartlett had been unwell for months. His illness had narrowed his life, reducing him from a working tradesman to a man whose days were measured in discomfort and the fragile hope of rest. The move to Pimlico was explained as practical: quieter lodgings, fewer disruptions, a room that could be kept warm and controlled. A sick man wants quiet. A caregiver wants order. In many households, that would have been the end of it. The problem was that the body refused the ordinary story. At the time of death, there was no shattered scene to confirm violence. No obvious struggle. No visible wounds. The room did not present itself as a place where a man had been attacked. It presented itself as a sick room that had fallen still. In Victorian London, a man dying in bed was not remarkable. It was the expected kind of death. The remarkable part arrived later, after the post-mortem, when doctors found chloroform in Edwin Bartlett's stomach in a quantity sufficient to kill. Chloroform was not exotic. It was familiar. It belonged to the modernizing world of Victorian medicine, to operating theaters and clinical experiments, to the chemical confidence of the age. It could also be purchased. It could sit in bottles among other remedies. It was capable of bringing swift unconsciousness through inhalation. It was not, however, a substance that naturally appeared in the stomach in lethal amount without explanation. And there was another complication: the tissues of Edwin's mouth and throat did not show the damage many expected if chloroform had been swallowed in the ordinary way. From that moment, the room at Claverton Street stopped being a sick room and became a riddle. The objects inside it, glasses, bottles, cloths, bedding, were reimagined as evidence. The movements of the people inside it were reassembled into a timeline. What had been care became potential control. What had been privacy became potential concealment. Adelaide Bartlett, until then a wife attending an invalid husband, became the center of scrutiny because she had what investigators look for first when science delivers an anomaly: access. She could enter the room without question. She could administer remedies without suspicion. She could manage servants and visitors. She could shape what was seen and what was not. George Dyson, a Wesleyan minister and tutor who had become closely associated with Adelaide, became a second focus not because the record could place his hand on the bottle, but because his presence supplied what the case otherwise lacked: a motive narrative. A minister in a married woman's orbit provided scandal. Scandal provided a story. And when a death offers no clear method, story becomes dangerously persuasive. The law would later demand more than story. It would demand proof. In the months that followed, the Bartlett household would be dismantled in public. Servants would be questioned. Doctors would argue. Chemists would be consulted. Private marital arrangements, separate bedrooms, childlessness, the claimed end of marital relations, would be dragged into sworn testimony. A marriage that had been managed quietly for years would be treated as a set of suspicious conditions. At the Old Bailey, the Crown would attempt to persuade a jury that chloroform meant murder, and that murder meant Adelaide. The defense would insist that chloroform did not automatically create a pathway, and without pathway the Crown could not lawfully convict. The jury would acquit Adelaide Bartlett. The public would continue to argue. The room at Claverton Street would remain in the case record, both ordinary and poisoned, a temporary lodging that became permanent in the history of Victorian crime because it contained a death that could be detected but not fully explained. And that is where this story begins. Chapter 1, Mysterious Origins and Early Life, 1855 to 1875. Adelaide Blanche de la Tremouille enters the record the way certain 19th-century women do, as a name surrounded by implication. The outline is recognizable: born in France, raised under partial acknowledgement, educated beyond her station, then transferred into England where social reinvention was possible. The detail is less cooperative. That unevenness is not unusual for an illegitimate child whose guardianship depended on discretion. The absence of clean documentation is part of the mechanism by which such lives were managed. In 1855, France and England were not merely neighboring nations with different flags. They were different systems of class, different systems of naming, different systems of what could be admitted without consequence. In either system, illegitimacy carried weight. It changed inheritance rights. It changed social assumption. It changed the kind of questions people felt entitled to ask. For a woman, it also changed what marriage could repair. Adelaide's mother, Clara Chamberlain, was English. Later descriptions of her do not dwell on detail. They use shorthand, obscure, a woman of low position, without standing. The shorthand matters because it reveals the perspective of those writing. It describes not Clara's character, but her leverage. A woman without family power could be praised or blamed. Either way, she could not force respect. If she became pregnant by a man of higher standing, the imbalance would be structural. She could not compel a public name. She could not compel a legal claim. She could only negotiate privately, and private negotiation leaves thin records. Adelaide's father was widely believed to be Adolphe Collot de la Tremouille, Comte de Thouars d'Escurey. In later retellings, this claim is repeated with varying levels of confidence. Some state it as fact, others treat it as probable. The truth is that the claim sits in a region where Victorian society often placed inconvenient realities everyone knew, but few could prove. Naming patterns, later allowances, and the plausibility of patronage suggest connection. The lack of a clean public acknowledgement suggests limitation. Aristocratic men could be generous in private while ruthless in public, because public acknowledgement risked scandal, marital conflict, and legal complications around inheritance. A child born under such circumstances was not necessarily unwanted. She was simply unwanted in daylight. The earliest years of Adelaide's life are not preserved in the form modern readers might expect. There are no neat childhood diaries or publicly celebrated baptisms. If there was baptism, it was not used later as evidence of belonging. What emerges instead is an inference built from outcomes. Adelaide did not grow up in poverty. She was educated. She developed accomplishments, languages, music, social manner, that required money and a stable environment. Those accomplishments do not appear by accident. They appear through investment. Investment implies patronage. The most plausible structure is that Adelaide was raised under supervised care, likely separated from the public life of the man believed to be her father. Such arrangements were common. A child could be placed with guardians, educated in convents or boarding schools, and supported through allowances that were not publicly linked to the paternal name. This allowed the patron to maintain a moral facade while fulfilling private obligation. It also allowed the child to develop without being fully absorbed into the family she could not publicly claim. For Adelaide, this kind of childhood would have produced a particular kind of adult competence. A girl raised under conditional belonging learns early that stability is not guaranteed. She learns the difference between private truth and public story. She learns to speak in ways that do not invite further questions. She learns to hold emotion behind a face that appears composed. Such traits are sometimes called coldness later, when observers seek to interpret them morally. In practice, they can be survival. There are references suggesting Adelaide may have been educated in a convent environment. Whether that is definitively provable matters less than what it implies: training in discipline, modest presentation, and the internalization of silence as virtue. Convent schooling also offered language education and music training, both of which Adelaide later demonstrated. The education associated with such institutions could be excellent, but it came with a social shaping. A girl learns to be watched, to correct herself before she is corrected, to move through a structured world without breaking its rules. Adelaide's later life suggests she had this training. By adolescence, she appears to have been comfortably bilingual, capable in refined conversation, and equipped with a kind of social poise that did not match the supposed modest origins of her mother. This mismatch, obscure mother, refined daughter, is one of the reasons observers assumed aristocratic paternity. They could not easily explain the refinement otherwise. In the Victorian imagination, refinement required breeding. The truth is that refinement can be purchased in schools and instilled through strict training. Aristocratic connection is one plausible explanation, but not the only one. What matters for the case is not whether the Count was the father, but that Adelaide carried a social ambiguity that made people restless. Restless people invent stories. She was later sent to England to live with maternal relatives in Kingston upon Thames. The move was strategic in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud. England offered distance. It offered a new social field where a young woman could be presented with fewer questions about old circumstances. Kingston offered respectability, a carefully observed social environment where a young woman's good conduct could build a reputation quickly. It also offered the kind of family supervision Victorian society demanded for unmarried women. From the outside, Adelaide in Kingston would have looked like a well-brought-up young woman with continental education and good manners. From the inside, she was a young woman whose position depended on maintaining that perception. A woman in her situation did not have room for public misstep. She could not rely on a powerful father's public protection. She could rely only on her capacity to behave in ways that made questioning seem improper. This is where Adelaide's story begins to tighten toward the later case. A person trained in perception management does not suddenly acquire those skills when a trial begins. They bring them. The ability to remain composed under scrutiny, to offer limited information without appearing evasive, to allow ambiguity without collapsing into contradiction, these are practiced traits. In Kingston, Adelaide became known in the local social circle. She attended gatherings. She was received. Her foreign education made her interesting. At the same time, she did not behave like a woman seeking attention. Her value lay in being distinctive without being disorderly. Victorian society could tolerate foreignness if it was paired with restraint. She was, by most accounts, beautiful in a way that was legible to the era, pale, delicate, refined. Beauty in Victorian culture was not merely physical. It was also behavioral. A woman who moved correctly, spoke correctly, and dressed correctly was beautiful, even when her features were ordinary. Adelaide appears to have met that standard. She could present herself as a woman meant for a good marriage. Marriage was the obvious and necessary next step. For many women, marriage was social advancement. For Adelaide, marriage was also containment. It could secure her position and reduce the need to answer questions about origin. A husband's name could become a shield. A husband's household could become a new record of respectability. This is the period where Edwin Bartlett enters the story, but before he does, the environment matters. Kingston offered the kind of respectable setting where a tradesman seeking refinement might look for a wife who could elevate his social standing. Edwin's prosperity meant he could choose among local women. Choosing Adelaide suggests he valued something beyond ordinary domestic competence. He valued the aura she carried. The aura was built from education, foreignness, and the suggestion of aristocratic connection. It did not need to be confirmed. It needed only to be plausible. Edwin Bartlett, when he first appears in the record, appears as a man who had done what Victorian society claimed to admire. He had built himself. He was not born into title. He was born into work. His wealth was visible and earned. His respectability was linked to discipline and commerce. But commerce had its ceiling. A grocer could be wealthy and still be treated as socially lesser by those who measured worth in lineage rather than money. A wife like Adelaide could raise that ceiling. This is why their match, on its face, made sense. It was an exchange common in Victorian England: money for refinement, stability for status, the security of trade for the polish of education. Such exchanges were not always cynical. They could include affection. But they were grounded in social structure. The courtship began under observation, as most did. People called. People visited. Conversations occurred in parlors rather than private rooms. There would have been chaperones, or at least the assumption that a young woman was not alone with a man. Respectability required performance. For Adelaide, this was familiar. She had been performing respectability for years. For Edwin, Courtship was an investment. It was the step before legal union. It was also the step where he could assess whether Adelaide's polish was real and whether her public behaviour would support his ambitions. By all accounts, it did. She did not behave like a reckless or impulsive girl. She behaved like a woman capable of sustaining a respectable household. The marriage that followed would be respectable on the surface. It would also become one of the most scrutinized marriages in Victorian true crime history precisely because it did not operate the way outsiders assumed. But before the separate bedrooms and the whispered theories, before the chloroform and the Old Bailey, there was simply a young woman with a carefully managed past, positioned in Kingston as suitable, and a prosperous grocer who saw in her a form of elevation. Their meeting was not dramatic. It was ordinary in its social mechanics. The extraordinary part came later, when the private structure of the marriage and the impossibility of Edwin's death forced the public to look at Adelaide's life as if it were a puzzle designed to be solved. Chapter 2, The Marriage and Its Private Rules, 1875 to 1878. The Bartlett marriage begins as many Victorian marriages did, with the outward forms of propriety intact and the inward terms known only to the two people signing the register. The wedding itself was not the kind that would have drawn attention across London. There was no titled family publicly claiming the bride. There was no glittering social spectacle. There was, instead, the familiar architecture of respectable union, a prosperous man, a refined young woman, and a community prepared to accept the match because it looked correct. Thomas Edwin Bartlett had built wealth through trade. He owned grocery interests and pursued expansion with the steady confidence of a man accustomed to improving his position by effort. In Victorian England, success in business could deliver comfort but not necessarily social equality with those who inherited their place. Edwin's prosperity solved practical problems. It did not automatically solve the problem of standing. Adelaide solved that problem. She brought a kind of polish that could not be bought in a shop or earned in a ledger. She spoke as an educated woman. She carried herself as though she had been trained under scrutiny. Her accent, her language skills, her manners, and her air of continental refinement made her useful in a way Victorian society readily understood. She could host. She could converse. She could make a tradesman's home look like a gentility project completed. For Adelaide, Edwin's value was simpler and more urgent. He offered stability. He offered legitimacy. He offered the right kind of name, not noble, but respectable, English, and attached to money. A married woman's position was socially clearer than an unmarried woman's, especially when the unmarried woman's origins invited curiosity. Marriage could quiet questions. It could also create a protective wall between Adelaide and the precariousness of depending on relatives or patrons. They married in 1876. To a neighbor, the marriage might have looked ordinary. What made it unusual did not sit in the ceremony. It sat in what happened next. Instead of beginning married life with immediate domestic union, Edwin placed Adelaide in continued education. She was sent to a boarding arrangement in Stoke Newington. Later she was sent to Belgium for finishing. The idea, on the surface, was refinement, completing education, polishing language, cultivating the kind of genteel accomplishments that would allow Adelaide to perform the wife role in higher social settings. In Edwin's mind, this may have been a continuation of his long investment in Adelaide's making. He had, after all, chosen her in part for her refinement. It is possible he wanted that refinement perfected to match his ambitions. But the decision remains remarkable in its effect. It delayed cohabitation. It delayed ordinary married routine. It created an early marriage marked by separation rather than intimacy. Victorian society understood boarding school and finishing school as preparation for marriage. It did not usually understand them as something that continued after marriage. A married woman was presumed to have left the schoolroom behind. She had the household now. She had the husband. She had the expected physical and domestic role. Edwin's decision disrupted that expectation. It suggested either that he valued Adelaide's refinement so highly he was willing to shape his marriage around it, or that the marriage itself carried private complications that made immediate cohabitation undesirable. The record does not provide a definitive answer. What it provides is a pattern that later observers would use as the first sign that the Bartlett marriage did not function normally. Adelaide returned intermittently during this period. Holidays and visits created contact, but not continuous shared life. The marriage, in its earliest stage, did not build the kind of ordinary intimacy most couples develop through daily proximity. This mattered later because it made the relationship easier to reinterpret. A marriage built on separations is vulnerable to being described as cold or artificial, even if the separations had practical reasons. The second unusual element was not visible to outsiders at all until the case became public. In later sworn testimony, Adelaide stated that sexual relations between herself and Edwin were rare to the point of non-existence. According to her account, the marriage was consummated once, for the purpose of conception. She became pregnant. The pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. After that, she said, there were no further marital relations. The claim was extraordinary. It cut against Victorian assumptions so strongly that many people treated it as either proof of a strange household or evidence that Adelaide was lying. In court and in commentary, the statement became both weapon and shield, a weapon for those who wanted to portray the marriage as unnatural and unstable, and a shield for those who argued Adelaide had no motive grounded in conventional jealousy or passion because the marriage was not physically intimate. What the statement does most reliably establish is that the Bartlett marriage did not align with public expectation. Whether the cessation was mutual, imposed, or simply developed through circumstances and preference is unclear. Victorian couples sometimes lived in separate bedrooms for health, habit, or quiet incompatibility, but the permanent absence of marital intimacy was unusual enough to become the case's most discussed domestic fact. Separate bedrooms, as a practice, also have practical implications for the later story. Separate bedrooms mean different patterns of nighttime routine. They mean different expectations about who enters whose space. They mean a household where physical closeness is not assumed, which can shape trust, dependency, and emotional exchange in subtle ways. In the years after the alleged cessation, the marriage did not collapse publicly. It continued. Adelaide returned from education and moved fully into the household. Edwin continued to fund her, to protect her, and to place her at the center of his domestic world. This suggests the marriage was not a mere legal shell. It was an arrangement that both parties chose to maintain. By 1878, Adelaide was living with Edwin above his grocery establishment in Herne Hill. The setting was typical for a prosperous tradesman, business below, domestic life above or nearby. This arrangement created a particular kind of household rhythm. The shop imposed schedule. Customers arrived. Supplies were delivered. Staff worked. The home existed in the shadow of commerce. A wife in such a setting performed not only domestic duty but social management. She softened trade's coarseness into respectability. Adelaide did this effectively. Her education allowed her to host, entertain, and create an atmosphere that made Edwin's trade wealth feel like gentility rather than mere profit. Guests later described her as accomplished. She played piano. She conversed with confidence. She appeared to understand social cues and the delicate art of being interesting without being improper. This mattered because it shows Adelaide was not merely sheltered. She was socially active. She knew how she was perceived. She knew how to manage a room. Those skills would later become part of the prosecution's implied narrative. A woman capable of managing perception might be capable of managing deception. The defense would argue the opposite. A woman trained in composure would naturally appear composed under stress. The same facts could be read in opposing directions. In 1878, another event revealed the household's fragile undercurrents. Edwin's father, living with them after being widowed, accused Adelaide of impropriety with Edwin's brother Frederick. The allegation was serious and, in Victorian terms, catastrophic. If believed, it would have destroyed Adelaide socially. It would also have destabilized Edwin's family standing. Edwin's response was swift and formal. He demanded his father retract the accusation before a solicitor. The retraction was made. On the surface, the matter was closed. In reality, it revealed several things. It showed Adelaide was watched by at least one member of Edwin's family with suspicion. It showed Edwin's loyalty to his wife was intense enough to override paternal authority. It showed Edwin understood reputation as something that must be defended with legal force, not merely private argument. It also introduced the theme of accusation and denial that would later dominate the case. Once a household has faced an internal allegation of sexual misconduct, even if retracted, the household carries a residue of mistrust. The accusation becomes a story people remember, even if they agree not to speak it aloud. When later scandal arrives, old allegations are revived and repurposed. They become patterns. The Bartlett marriage by 1878 can therefore be described as a household with a polished exterior and an unusual interior structure. A prosperous man devoted to his wife. A refined woman with an ambiguous past. An absence of children. A private sexual arrangement outside ordinary expectation. A family accusation of impropriety retracted but not necessarily forgotten. A household managed carefully to preserve respectability. None of these elements prove crime. They do, however, establish the environment in which later suspicion would flourish. When Edwin Bartlett died with chloroform in his stomach, investigators and journalists did not look at a plainly conventional marriage and ask, what went wrong? They looked at a marriage already marked by irregularity and asked, what was always wrong? This shift, from irregularity as private oddity to irregularity as public motive, is one of the case's defining movements. Chapter 3, A Respectable House with No Children, 1878 to 1885. Once Adelaide returned fully to Edwin's household, the Bartletts acquired a stable public shape. They lived in Herne Hill, a district where respectability was maintained through repetition, the same faces at shops, the same rhythm of church-going, the same careful distance from the kinds of people whose disorder might stain a neighbor by association. It was a place where domestic life was watched, not aggressively, but persistently, through glances, invitations, and the quiet accounting that takes place in drawing rooms and behind counters. Adelaide understood such accounting. Her life had depended on it. In the years between her return and Edwin's death, the Bartlett home functioned as a performance of middle-class success. Edwin's trade prosperity provided the resources. Adelaide provided the refinement that made those resources appear like culture rather than commerce. They entertained. They received visitors. They conducted themselves as a couple with stability. To an outsider, the Bartletts were not tragic or strange. They were a prosperous household with a wife who seemed too polished for trade origins and a husband who seemed pleased to have her. The most persistent absence was also the one most likely to be noticed by polite society. There were no children. Victorians did not openly interrogate fertility in respectable company, but the topic hovered. Childlessness could be interpreted in several ways, as misfortune, as medical problem, as private incompatibility, or as moral failing. In many families, children were not simply emotional fulfillment, they were social glue. They connected a couple to kin networks. They created obligations that stabilized marriages. They supplied future heirs. They also distracted attention from the private terms of a relationship by filling the house with noise and visible purpose. The Bartlett household lacked that noise. In a home without children, the relationship between husband and wife bears more weight. Attention remains concentrated. Emotional dependency can intensify. Dissatisfaction can become sharper. A couple can remain stable and companionable without children, but the household becomes easier for outsiders to interpret because there are fewer visible markers of ordinary domestic life. For the Bartletts, childlessness interacted with the marriage's private rules. If Adelaide's later account was true, that the marriage had effectively ceased sexually after early miscarriage or stillbirth, then the absence of children was not simply misfortune. It was structural. It was part of how the marriage operated. Edwin, however, continued to behave as though Adelaide was not merely his wife but his project and his center. His devotion appears in patterns: continued spending on her education and accomplishments, the insistence on protecting her name, the apparent willingness to shape domestic life around her preferences. He treated her refinement as something to be cultivated, and perhaps as something he had earned by marrying her. This kind of devotion can be generous. It can also be possessive. The record does not allow certainty about Edwin's inner motives, but it does show a man for whom Adelaide's status and behavior mattered intensely. In a marriage that did not follow conventional intimacy, devotion can transform into control through subtle channels: financial dependence, social gatekeeping, and the expectation that a wife should perform gratitude as well as propriety. Adelaide's position inside this devotion is harder to measure because she left fewer direct statements about her feelings in this period. What survives is observation. Observers described her as composed and intelligent. They described a woman who could host and converse. They did not describe an openly affectionate marriage. They described functionality. Functionality is not necessarily happiness, but it can be stability. The Bartlett home also included Edwin's father for a period. The earlier accusation of impropriety and the formal retraction had not occurred in a vacuum. Living arrangements like this often produce friction, generational authority, competing domestic preferences, and the way a young wife is judged by an older man who believes he holds the moral right to monitor the household. Even with the retraction, the episode would have left a residue of discomfort. In Victorian homes, discomfort often becomes silence. Silence becomes private distance. Private distance becomes part of how a household learns to operate. Adelaide's control over herself, her manner, her speech, her routines, would have been reinforced by such pressure. A woman who knows she is watched is unlikely to be careless. A woman who knows an older man has already accused her once is unlikely to provide material for a second accusation. This matters later because it shaped how Adelaide was perceived at trial. A woman trained in restraint will often appear unemotional when compared to Victorian expectations of feminine fragility. The courtroom audience, steeped in those expectations, may treat restraint as coldness. The record itself cannot resolve that difference. It can only show that restraint existed. As the years passed, Adelaide continued to cultivate education and intellectual interest. She read widely and maintained cultural engagement. There is an impression of a woman whose mind was active, perhaps restless. Intellectual stimulation is not evidence of dissatisfaction, but it can become important in a household where the marriage is structurally limited. A woman who has been trained to grow intellectually can chafe against domestic narrowing. Edwin encouraged education, at least in outward form. He funded tutoring and refinement. The question is whether education was offered as freedom or as improvement, whether it expanded Adelaide's agency or simply polished the ornament of the household. Men of Edwin's position sometimes valued educated wives as social assets rather than as independent minds. Such husbands wanted brilliance on display, not necessarily autonomy behind it. In that context, Adelaide's later connection with George Dyson becomes easier to understand. A tutor or minister could offer not just instruction but conversation. Conversation, in a household marked by private distance, can become intimate quickly. Intimacy does not require sex. It requires attention. The Bartlett routine through the early 1880s would have been shaped by business and social scheduling. Edwin's grocery interests demanded stability, and Adelaide's hosting required predictability. Their days likely followed patterns, Edwin leaving for the business, Adelaide managing domestic matters, servants performing their roles, visitors received at set hours. This predictability is important, because in later inquest testimony, predictability became a reference point. Witnesses could say what was usual, and therefore identify what was unusual in the months before Edwin died. In true crime reconstruction, the shift from usual to unusual is where the story begins. That shift arrived through Edwin's health. Edwin developed worsening gastric complaints over time. The symptoms were not uncommon, but their persistence and severity increased. In Victorian medicine, digestive illness was treated with a mixture of dietary adjustment, tonics, sedatives, and rest. It was not always treated with clear diagnostic confidence. A man might be told to avoid heavy food, to take certain mixtures, to rest more, to reduce stress. The recommended remedies could be extensive. In a household, extensive remedies create a new kind of domestic landscape: bottles, powders, mixtures, instructions. The sick person becomes dependent on whoever manages these substances. The boundary between medicine and danger is not always visible, especially when the household has become accustomed to chemicals as part of routine care. As Edwin's illness progressed, Adelaide's role in the household changed. A wife is always manager in some sense, but nursing intensifies management. It creates a hierarchy that is not announced but felt. The person who controls medicine and access controls the sick person's world. Adelaide increasingly became gatekeeper. Servants might bring trays, but Adelaide could decide what went on the tray. Doctors might offer advice, but Adelaide could decide how that advice was implemented in practice. Edwin might speak, but illness could reduce his capacity to assert. Even a devoted husband can become passive when pain dominates. This is one of the most significant dynamics in the Bartlett case. It is not dramatic. It is domestic. It is the quiet shift that makes later theories possible without requiring overt conflict. By 1885, the household was already operating under the pressure of Edwin's decline. It was in this climate that George Dyson's presence became embedded. Dyson's arrival did not create Edwin's illness, but it intersected with the household's changing power dynamics. A third person entering an already unusual marriage under the pressure of illness creates instability even if no crime occurs. It creates emotional rearrangement. It creates new access. And in a case later dominated by questions of who had access, new access is never treated as neutral. Chapter 4, The Minister, the Tutor, the Companion, 1885. George Dyson arrived in the Bartlett household as a respectable solution to a respectable desire. He was a Wesleyan minister and tutor, educated enough to teach and socially permitted to enter homes without immediate suspicion. In a middle-class setting like Herne Hill, a minister's visits could be framed as moral guidance, and a tutor's visits could be framed as refinement. The arrangement could be explained neatly. That neatness mattered, because what became notorious later was not simply that Dyson visited, but that he visited often, privately, and in a household already marked by unconventional domestic rules. In Victorian London, respectability did not mean innocence. It meant accepted presentation. Dyson's profession granted him a kind of access other men could not easily obtain. He could sit with a married woman in conversation under the assumption that the conversation was proper. He could speak to her privately in the language of instruction and guidance. He could be present during illness without appearing intrusive. His role was a social pass. Whether he used that pass in a way that crossed marital boundaries is the question the case later revolved around. The historical record does not offer the kind of direct proof modern readers might imagine. It offers patterns, frequency, privacy, and observed closeness. Those patterns were enough to inflame suspicion in 1886, and they remain enough to sustain argument now. Dyson's entry was not sudden. It was facilitated by the household's existing values. Edwin Bartlett had already shown a willingness to invest in Adelaide's education and refinement. He had sent her away for schooling after marriage. He had funded polishing projects that made little practical sense beyond social ambition. Bringing a tutor into the home, therefore, could be presented as continuity rather than disruption. If Adelaide wished to continue improving, a tutor was a plausible means. If Edwin valued her refinement as social currency, a tutor was a plausible investment. The arrangement's plausibility is important because it explains why Dyson could become a regular presence without immediate alarm. But plausibility does not prevent intimacy. A tutor does not only teach. He pays attention. He listens. He adjusts his instruction to the student's interests. He creates a rhythm of private meetings. In a household where a marriage is emotionally distant, attention can become the most potent form of intimacy available. The Bartlett marriage, by Adelaide's later account, lacked physical intimacy. Even if that account is treated cautiously, the household's lack of children and reported separate bedrooms suggests an arrangement outside ordinary expectation. Such an arrangement can exist peacefully. It can also create emotional vacancies. A third party entering that space can be received not as intruder but as relief. Dyson's visits increased. He became familiar. Familiarity is not scandalous until it becomes visible. In Herne Hill, visibility mattered. Neighbors and servants observed comings and goings. They noticed patterns. They might not speak of them directly, but they stored them. And when Edwin died, stored observations became testimony. Witnesses later described Dyson's presence as frequent enough to provoke comment. Some suggested an intimacy in manner between Dyson and Adelaide, the kind of ease that does not develop through occasional tutoring. The household, as a system, appeared to accommodate Dyson. He was not treated as a rare visitor. He was treated as part of the domestic rhythm. This is where Edwin's role becomes a key point of tension in interpretation. Edwin did not act publicly as though Dyson's presence was an insult. There was no clear rupture, no open confrontation that survived in record as a decisive event. Instead, Edwin either tolerated Dyson or permitted him. This tolerance is unsettling to observers because it disrupts the expected Victorian husband script. A husband was supposed to defend his marital authority. He was supposed to resist male intrusion. If he did not, then either he was blind, or he had his own reasons, or the marriage operated under rules outsiders could not understand. This uncertainty became fertile ground for later speculation. It also became something the prosecution could hint at while the defense would attempt to neutralize. By 1885, Edwin's illness was worsening. Illness changes a household's politics. A strong man can enforce boundaries. A sick man may lack energy to enforce anything. Pain reduces patience. Weakness reduces attention. The sick person's world narrows, and the well person's world expands because they must manage everything the sick person can no longer manage. In the Bartlett household, Adelaide's administrative role expanded as Edwin declined. This administrative role had practical dimensions: managing doctors, arranging medicines, instructing servants, deciding who could visit Edwin and when. It also had psychological dimensions. A sick man becomes emotionally dependent on the person closest to him. He may fear abandonment. He may cling. He may become more controlling or more compliant. Both reactions occur in illness. The record offers only glimpses, not a full interior portrait. What the record does show is that Edwin remained devoted to Adelaide. He had previously defended her against familial accusation. He continued to provide for her. He continued to treat her as central. Devotion under illness can become intensified because the sick person's world shrinks to the relationship. Devotion can also become desperate. It can manifest as pleading, fear, or attempts to secure loyalty. This is where later narratives of motive grow. If Edwin was devoted and dependent, Adelaide's choices had greater impact. If Adelaide felt trapped or restless, Edwin's dependence could feel like pressure. If Dyson provided emotional companionship, the triangle's tension could sharpen. But it is essential to keep the frame honest. Tension is not murder. Many households contain tension without crime. The case becomes criminal only when chloroform appears, and chloroform appears only after death. The press, however, does not wait for chloroform to build narrative. The press builds narrative from human material. In 1885, before Edwin died, Dyson's presence might have already been a topic of quiet comment in social circles. Victorian neighborhoods often handled perceived impropriety with whispered warning rather than open confrontation. A woman's behavior could be discussed behind her back and never addressed directly to her face. This kind of social pressure can feel invisible to modern readers because it leaves limited documentation. It existed nonetheless. Dyson's position as a minister made the perceived impropriety sharper. An ordinary tutor might have been suspected of seduction. A minister invited scandal of a different flavor: hypocrisy, betrayal of calling, the corruption of virtue. Victorian society loved this kind of fall narrative because it combined sex and morality in a way that felt like punishment. If Dyson and Adelaide were merely close friends, the social penalty would still have been severe because intimacy between a married woman and a man outside her family was rarely treated as harmless. If they were lovers, the penalty would have been worse. In either case, the mere possibility created risk. In a household already operating under unusual rules, risk accumulates quietly. A person does not need to commit crime to fear scandal. They only need to be near it. The relationship between Adelaide and Dyson, whatever its true nature, also had a practical consequence relevant to later investigation. It increased Dyson's access to the household's internal workings. A frequent visitor learns the rhythm of servants, the locations of medicine, the schedule of doctor visits, the pattern of Edwin's illness. He becomes familiar enough that his presence no longer triggers heightened attention. Familiarity is the foundation of unnoticed opportunity. This does not prove Dyson acted. It explains why investigators later could not ignore him. By late 1885, the Bartlett household was in a fragile configuration. Edwin was ill and increasingly dependent. Adelaide was managing the household with controlled composure. Dyson was present with unusual frequency and intimacy. The marriage's private rules were already outside the norm. A fragile configuration does not guarantee violence. It does, however, create conditions where any sudden death will be interpreted through existing suspicion. When Edwin's health deteriorated further in December, the household's decisions became more urgent. Remedies were intensified. Nursing became central. Privacy increased. And then a crucial move was made. Edwin was relocated to Pimlico lodgings. That move is where the case's final stage begins. Because once Edwin entered that rented room, the number of people who could truly witness the last hours decreased sharply. The household became small and controlled. Whatever happened next would be known through a narrow channel. Chapter 5, December, Nursing, Seclusion, and the Narrowing Room, 1885. Illness does not usually arrive as a single dramatic event. It creeps. It alters small routines first. Appetite changes, sleep is interrupted, a man who used to rise early stays in bed longer, A conversation that once lasted an hour ends after 10 minutes because fatigue takes over. Households adapt without announcing that they are adapting. Only later, when someone dies, does the slow shift become visible as a chain. By December 1885, the Bartlett household had been adapting for some time. Edwin's gastric illness was no longer a background problem. It was the organizing feature of the day. His strength was reduced. His comfort was fragile. The household's rhythm increasingly revolved around his symptoms and the effort to manage them. This is the stage of sickness where care becomes indistinguishable from control to outsiders. Inside a sickroom, control can be benevolent, restricting visitors so the patient can rest, limiting conversation so agitation is reduced, administering sedatives so sleep is possible. But the same actions, viewed after a suspicious death, can be reframed as concealment. A visitor refused becomes a witness removed. A servant dismissed becomes an observer excluded. A sedative administered becomes a substance introduced. The Bartlett case turned on this reframing. Edwin's condition, as described later, involved stomach pain and weakness. Whether the illness was ulcerative, cancerous, infectious, or something else is less important to the narrative than its effect, it made Edwin reliant. A man who is constantly unwell begins to surrender ordinary autonomy. He stops making certain decisions. He permits others to handle tasks he once controlled. He accepts medicines at appointed times rather than choosing his own. He stops engaging fully with the outside world because even small social encounters cost energy. In Victorian middle-class homes, prolonged illness was typically managed privately. Hospital care was not the default for a man of Edwin's means unless surgery or acute crisis demanded it. Instead, doctors visited the home. Remedies were obtained from chemists. Nursing became a domestic operation. That operation required supplies, mixtures, powders, tonics, sedatives, and whatever strengthening preparations the era favored. It required bottles. It required instruction. It created a physical landscape in which chemicals were normal, and in which a household could hold substances that would later appear sinister only because of outcome. In a poison case, the normalization of chemicals is the most dangerous background fact. It allows a lethal substance to sit among ordinary remedies without being instantly alarming to the people living with it. Adelaide's role in this operation expanded. She was the person most consistently near Edwin. She was the person who could interpret his requests for relief. She was the person who could decide how strictly doctor instructions were followed, how medicines were measured, and how servants were directed. In true crime reconstruction, it is tempting to treat the caregiver's centrality as suspicious. The reality is that in most sick households, the caregiver is central. That centrality becomes suspicious only when death produces an anomaly. The household also contained servants, and servants mattered because they were the closest thing the case had to neutral observers. Servants saw routine. They saw who entered. They saw which bottles were handled. They saw tone and habit. They did not necessarily understand motive. Their testimony later provided scaffolding, the ordinary movements that could be checked against each other. But servants are also limited witnesses. The more private a household becomes, the less servants see. A mistress can dismiss a servant from a room with a phrase. A servant, in Victorian hierarchy, rarely challenges. The very structure of domestic service creates blind spots by design. Privacy is preserved through obedience. As Edwin worsened, privacy increased. Visitors may have been reduced. Conversations may have been shortened. Edwin's world narrowed to the people who were allowed in close. In a typical case of illness, the narrowing is compassionate. In a case that becomes suspicious, narrowing looks like preparation. By late December, a decision was made that would later carry heavy interpretive weight. Edwin was moved to lodgings in Pimlico, at 85 Claverton Street. On paper, the decision had plausible nursing logic. Lodgings could be quieter. They could be arranged specifically for the sick man's comfort. They could reduce noise from business and household traffic. They could remove Edwin from daily pressures. Many families sought such arrangements for invalid relatives. The move could be read as an attempt to create controlled rest. But controlled rest also means controlled access. A rented room is not a family home. It is a space with fewer embedded witnesses. In a family home, there are established patterns of neighbor observation, established servant routines, established household familiarity with where objects belong. In lodgings, everything is temporary. Temporary spaces are easier to manage in ways that leave fewer traces. They also make it harder for investigators to determine what is usual and what is unusual, because there is no long baseline. The decision to move Edwin therefore became a pivot point in later narratives. The prosecution could suggest it reduced oversight and increased opportunity. The defense could argue it was ordinary nursing practice for comfort. The truth is that the same action could plausibly serve both ends depending on intent, and intent was exactly what the court could not see. The move also altered the composition of those present. A lodgings arrangement typically involved fewer staff. The sick room became more concentrated. Adelaide's presence, as wife and organizer, became even more central. Servants might come and go, but the circle tightened. December in London added practical complications. Winter shortened days and disrupted routines. Holiday schedules affected availability of doctors, chemists, and transport. A man's symptoms could worsen in cold, damp conditions. Families often sought warm rooms and quiet during winter illness. Again, benign explanations existed. So did suspicious readings. Inside the lodgings, nursing continued. Edwin would have been in bed much of the time. His distress would have fluctuated. He might have improved briefly and then worsened. Such fluctuations are common in chronic illness. They can also complicate witness testimony, because witnesses tend to remember the worst moments more vividly than the ordinary ones. What matters for the case is that Edwin was seeking relief and that the household around him was administering substances designed to provide relief. Relief seeking creates vulnerability. A person desperate for sleep will accept stronger sedatives. A person exhausted by pain will accept whatever is offered if they believe it might help. A person who trusts the caregiver will take a dose without inspecting it. This is how accidental overdoses happen. It is also how deliberate poisonings can be masked as care. The Bartlett case lived in that overlap. During these days, Dyson's relationship to the household remained relevant. Whether he was present at the lodgings constantly or intermittently, his broader role in the household's emotional climate was already established. If Adelaide was emotionally close to Dyson, then Edwin's illness and dependence might have sharpened tension. If Adelaide was not emotionally close to Dyson, Dyson's presence still contributed to the perception of impropriety. Perception alone can create fear. Fear can create secrecy. Secrecy can create mistakes. The record cannot state definitively which of these dynamics dominated, but it can state that the household was operating under pressure. By the last days of December, the narrative tightened further. Edwin's condition did not resolve. The lodging room became the stage for his final hours. The number of people who could later testify to those hours narrowed to a small set, and their accounts, filtered through grief, shock, and later scrutiny, became the only record of what occurred before the chloroform finding transformed everything. A true crime reconstruction cannot manufacture certainty where the record is thin. What it can do is maintain the shape. An ill man in a rented room. A wife managing nursing and access. A household already unusual in private structure. A minister-tutor embedded in the wife's emotional orbit. A set of medicines and remedies circulating as part of care. A final day arriving under the assumption that illness, not crime, was the enemy. Chapter 6, New Year's Day, The Quiet Room in Pimlico, January 1, 1886. The lodgings at 85, Claverton Street were not a place designed for endings. They were furnished for temporary occupancy, for the short-term needs of people passing through London. In the Bartlett case, the room became something else, a controlled space where nursing was meant to bring relief, and where a death that looked ordinary became extraordinary only after the body was opened. The final night of 1885 did not announce itself as historic. In the hours before midnight, Edwin Bartlett remained a sick man, not a murder victim. His condition had been worsening for weeks. He had been moved to Pimlico so the household could manage him quietly. Whatever arguments might later be built from that move, the immediate lived reality was simpler. The days were shaped by discomfort and the hope of rest. In sick rooms, hope often takes the form of small things. A spoonful of mixture that might ease the stomach. A glass of water taken slowly. The prospect of a few hours of sleep. The absence of pain for long enough to allow the mind to settle. These hopes do not require grand planning. They require a caregiver who can act, and a patient who can trust. Edwin was increasingly reliant on trust. He was not merely physically weak. Prolonged illness erodes patience, attention, and the ability to examine every decision. A sick man often stops asking detailed questions. He accepts what is brought because the alternative is to remain in discomfort. This creates a dynamic in which the caregiver's choices become decisive. Whether those choices are benevolent or harmful cannot be read directly from the dynamic itself. The dynamic exists in both innocent and criminal contexts. The Bartlett case forced that dynamic into the open. The hours before death. Accounts of the final hours survive through later testimony. They are filtered by memory, and memory is influenced by outcome. People remember what seems significant after the fact. They forget what seemed ordinary at the time. In reconstructing the night, the most reliable approach is to focus on structural facts rather than on emotional color. Edwin was ill. He was in lodgings. A small circle of people had access to him. Medicines and remedies were part of routine. He became quiet. He died. Between those points sits the unknown. It is likely Edwin experienced a worsening episode, pain, agitation, or distress, because such episodes are common in chronic gastric illness. It is also likely that those around him, particularly Adelaide, responded in the way caregivers often do, offering something intended to relieve. Relief could mean a sedative, a soothing draught, or a medicine believed to settle the stomach. In Victorian practice, such remedies were not always mild. They could include potent substances. The room would have contained ordinary nursing objects, a bed, glasses, bottles, perhaps basins, cloths, and whatever small supplies were required for comfort. None of these objects would have been alarming to someone living inside the illness. After the chloroform finding, every object became a potential instrument. A key feature of the scene, both at the time and later, was the absence of obvious struggle. Poison cases often lack struggle, but the Bartlett case required something more than the usual observation. If chloroform was swallowed, one might expect immediate sensation and resistance. If chloroform was forced, one might expect physical disorder. Yet the room did not present that. This absence made later theories complicated. Investigators had to imagine a method that could deliver a lethal quantity without leaving a clear path of distress or injury that matched ordinary expectations. The discovery of death. When Edwin became unresponsive, the immediate response was not necessarily to assume crime. The assumption, in a household managing prolonged illness, would have been that the illness had finally won. Death in bed was common. It was the standard Victorian death. Families were familiar with it. A doctor was called. The practical process of verification began. At this stage, the case could still have been handled as natural, an invalid dying after decline, if the post-mortem had not introduced a chemical contradiction. This is one of the most important psychological points in the case. Nobody living in the room that night necessarily understood they were living through a crime scene. The scene became a crime scene later, because the body refused the story the living had assumed. The post-mortem turning point. The post-mortem did not simply identify chloroform. It transformed the entire narrative architecture. Chloroform was found in Edwin Bartlett's stomach in a quantity sufficient to kill. That is the core fact. It is what made the case infamous. It is what pushed the death from private tragedy to public inquiry. Chloroform's presence was not easily explained by ordinary illness. Chloroform was used as an anesthetic by inhalation, not as a stomach medicine. It could be obtained, and it could exist in households, but it was not a substance that should be present in the stomach by coincidence in lethal amount. This single fact demanded investigation. But the Bartlett case did not stop there. It delivered an additional contradiction. The mouth and throat did not show the tissue damage doctors expected if chloroform had been swallowed. The absence of injury created the chloroform enigma. If Edwin swallowed chloroform, why did the tissues not show evidence? If he did not swallow it, how did it enter the stomach? If it was forced, why was there no struggle? If it was administered through some unusual mechanism, what mechanism, and by whom? If it was accidental, how could an accident deliver a lethal quantity? Each question produced another, and the answers did not align. This is why the case moved beyond ordinary poisoning narratives. It was not just who poisoned him. It was how could he have been poisoned at all? Suspicion forms around access. In the first stage after the chloroform discovery, investigators did what investigators do when science creates an anomaly: they look at access. Access is the most stable investigative principle. Even when method is unclear, The circle of people who could have acted is limited by proximity and opportunity. In the Pimlico room, access was concentrated. Adelaide Bartlett was the central figure of access. She was the wife. She was the organizer of nursing. She could enter the sick room at any time. She could bring medicine without drawing attention. She could shape what servants saw and what they did not. These are not allegations. They are structural truths of her role. The same role in any ordinary death would have been seen as devotion. In a chloroform death, it became opportunity. George Dyson also entered the access discussion, even where his direct presence at the moment of death was not always established. His embedded closeness to Adelaide and his frequent presence in the household created a second access pathway. He could potentially supply, advise, or collaborate. Again, these are investigative possibilities, not proofs. Edwin himself remained part of the access picture. Could he have self-administered? Could he have mistakenly swallowed something? Could he have taken chloroform seeking relief? The defense would later emphasize such possibilities because they preserved doubt. Investigators would consider them because they must. Yet self-administration did not neatly solve the tissue contradiction. It also did not neatly solve the question of why Edwin would take chloroform into his stomach in lethal amount. Possible does not mean probable, but in court, possible can be enough to defeat conviction if the prosecution cannot eliminate it. The death becomes public property. Once chloroform was found, Edwin's death could not remain inside the family's control. It became subject to coroner's procedure. It became subject to police interest. It became subject to press appetite. This is the moment Adelaide's life turned irreversibly. Before the postmortem, she was a wife managing illness. After the postmortem, she was the center of a public puzzle, and her private life became material. The household's unconventional structure, previously protected by silence, became relevant. The presence of Dyson, previously framed as tutoring, became suspect. The move to Pimlico, previously framed as comfort, became potential seclusion. The story shifted from illness to accusation without passing through a clear bridge of proved mechanism. That is the essential cruelty of the case. Accusation arrived through anomaly, not through observed criminal action. Interlude: chloroform in the Victorian imagination. By the time Edwin Bartlett died in January 1886, chloroform was no longer a scientific novelty. It had entered the medical mainstream decades earlier and was regarded, in many contexts, as one of the age's great triumphs. At the same time, it carried risk. It could relieve pain. It could also stop a heart. Understanding how chloroform was perceived in the 1880s is essential to understanding why its discovery in Edwin's stomach caused such shock, and why the debate about its administration became the center of the case. The arrival of chloroform. Chloroform was introduced into surgical practice in the late 1840s, shortly after the wider adoption of ether as an anesthetic. It gained rapid acceptance in Britain in part because it was more potent than ether and easier to administer in controlled environments. It did not require complex apparatus. A cloth and measured drops could induce unconsciousness. In hospitals and in private surgeries, chloroform represented modernity and relief from suffering. Its reputation was not purely benevolent. Even early in its use, doctors recorded sudden deaths during anesthesia. Chloroform could depress respiration and cardiac function. The margin between effective dose and fatal dose was narrower than many practitioners preferred. Debates about its safety ran through medical journals for decades. Yet it remained in use because its benefits in surgery were undeniable. By the 1880s, chloroform was embedded in British medical culture. It was not rare. It was not clandestine. It could be obtained from chemists. It could be present in respectable households, particularly those dealing with medical need. This accessibility is critical. In some poisoning cases, the substance itself signals intent because it is obscure or difficult to acquire. Chloroform did not carry that presumption. Its presence alone did not scream criminality. Its location in Edwin's stomach did. Inhalation versus ingestion. Chloroform was primarily used by inhalation. A patient breathed vapor, unconsciousness followed. The method was visible and familiar. Doctors understood that inhaled chloroform acted rapidly and could, in excess, kill quickly. The dangers were known and discussed. Manuals warned about dosage and monitoring. Ingestion, however, was not standard medical practice. Swallowing chloroform was not how anesthesia was achieved. It was not prescribed as a stomach remedy. The substance was irritating and caustic. Contemporary medical understanding suggested that swallowing a significant quantity would likely produce burning sensation and observable injury in the mouth and throat. This assumption lay at the center of the Bartlett trial. If chloroform was found in Edwin's stomach in lethal amount, the immediate inference was that he must have swallowed it. If he swallowed it, doctors expected to see evidence of contact damage in the upper digestive tract. When that evidence was not clearly present, the medical dispute began. Some experts argued that visible injury was inevitable with ingestion of such a substance. Others urged caution, noting that post-mortem changes, timing, and variability in tissue response might complicate neat expectations. Victorian forensic medicine was developing but not yet standardized. Laboratory protocols were less uniform than modern audiences might assume. Disagreement among experts was not unusual. The Bartlett case exposed this lack of uniformity in public. Domestic medicine and chemical normality. Victorian middle-class households often contained medicines that would alarm a modern observer. Laudanum, chloral hydrate, opiates, tonics containing alcohol or stimulants, these substances were part of ordinary domestic care. Illness was managed at home. A wife or servant might administer potent mixtures under instruction. The line between physician-supervised and household-administered medicine was porous. In such an environment, a bottle of chloroform in a household dealing with illness was not inherently incriminating. It could be justified as part of treatment, or at least as part of a medical supply acquired in anticipation of possible use. This context complicates the purchase question in the Bartlett case. Even if chloroform could be traced to the household, its mere presence did not automatically establish criminal intent. Investigators needed more than possession. They needed demonstration of administration. The science of detection. By the 1880s, toxicology had advanced enough to detect certain poisons with increasing reliability. Chloroform, being volatile, presented its own challenges. It evaporates readily. Its detection depended on timely examination and appropriate handling. The fact that chloroform was found in Edwin's stomach at all suggests that the post-mortem investigation was attentive. However, detection does not automatically supply narrative. Finding chloroform answers the question, was it present? It does not answer, how did it enter? This gap between chemical detection and behavioral explanation became the core problem at trial. Victorian jurors were being asked to evaluate expert testimony in a domain that was still evolving. The law required clarity. The science offered probability and disagreement. Public perception of poison. Poison held a particular fascination in Victorian culture. It was associated with secrecy, with domestic betrayal, with the idea that a woman, physically weaker than a man, could nonetheless kill through cunning. Sensational cases earlier in the century had cemented the archetype of the female poisoner in public imagination. Newspapers fed that archetype because it was profitable. Chloroform added a modern twist to this archetype. It was not arsenic slipped into tea. It was a scientific substance tied to hospitals and surgery. Its presence suggested a crime that exploited modern chemistry rather than ancient treachery. This combination, domestic setting plus modern chemical, made the Bartlett case feel both traditional and contemporary. The public did not need to understand the full toxicological debate to react strongly. The word chloroform alone carried weight. Why the chloroform question endures. The enduring fascination with the Bartlett case stems from the fact that chloroform's discovery proved something was wrong, but not precisely what or by whom. It created a paradox. If Edwin was poisoned, someone administered chloroform. If someone administered chloroform, a method must have existed. If a method existed, it should be explainable. If it cannot be explained convincingly, how can guilt be proved? This chain of reasoning trapped the prosecution. It also trapped later commentators. The chloroform interlude in the Bartlett case is not merely chemical background. It is the hinge on which the entire narrative turns. Without it, Edwin's death might have been attributed to chronic illness. With it, the household's private arrangements were dragged into forensic argument. The Victorian age believed in progress, scientific, industrial, moral. The Bartlett case revealed a limit to that confidence. Science could detect a poison. It could not, in this instance, translate detection into courtroom certainty. Chapter 7, The Inquest, Turning a Household into Evidence, January, March 1886. The inquest did not begin as spectacle. It began as procedure. A coroner's inquiry existed to establish cause of death and determine whether further legal action was required. Most inquests ended with tidy conclusions: disease, accident, misadventure. The Bartlett inquest could not end that way because the postmortem had introduced a finding that was, in Victorian terms, both unmistakable and unsettling. Chloroform in the stomach changed everything. It was a substance associated with medical practice, not with digestion. Its presence in lethal quantity suggested administration, not mere accident. Yet the absence of expected tissue injury meant the inquest could not simply declare poisoning by swallowing and move on. It was forced to wrestle with a mechanism it could not clearly demonstrate. When mechanism is unclear, investigators move toward what they can control: statements, timelines, and access. The inquest therefore became an exercise in converting the Bartlett household into a sequence of events. That conversion is never clean. It relies on memory, partial observation, and the way witnesses translate lived life into language under pressure. The inquest's first work was to establish the basic narrative. Edwin was ill, he was moved to Pimlico lodgings, he died, chloroform was found. From there, it began to ask the questions that defined suspected poisonings. Who had charge of the sick room? What medicines were administered? Who purchased or obtained substances? Who was present in the final hours? What did the doctors observe before and after death? What did servants see and what were they instructed to do? What was the nature of relationships inside the household? Each question pulled private life further into public record. Witnesses and the anatomy of routine. The Bartlett household servants were among the first significant witnesses. Servant testimony provides the skeleton of domestic cases because servants see repetition. They know which doors are normally open, which are normally closed, who visits regularly, and how the mistress behaves under ordinary conditions. They are often the only people in a household with no long-term stake in shaping the narrative, though they can still be influenced by loyalty, fear, and the social pressure of answering questions in public. The servants' accounts helped define Adelaide as organizer. She was the one managing Edwin's care, issuing instructions, and controlling access. This was not controversial as a description of role. It was contested in meaning. In a death that looked natural, it would have been evidence of wifely duty. In a death marked by chloroform, it became the foundation for suspicion because it established capability. Capability is not guilt. But in an inquest, capability is where inquiry begins. Servants could also speak to Dyson's presence. His visits were not purely theoretical. They were visible in the ordinary economy of the household. He arrived, he stayed, he was received by Adelaide. If servants noticed privacy or unusual length of visits, those details became part of the record. The inquest's difficulty was that servants could rarely testify to what occurred behind closed doors. They could testify only to patterns: closed doors, hushed conversations, the mistress's instructions, the visitor's frequency. Patterns, in Victorian moral culture, were enough to imply impropriety. In legal culture, they were context rather than proof. The inquest existed in the uncomfortable overlap between those cultures. Adelaide under oath. Adelaide's inquest testimony, and the way it was received, became one of the most significant factors in shaping the case's later trajectory. A woman's speech under Victorian scrutiny was interpreted through multiple lenses: class, gender, foreignness, and perceived sexual propriety. Adelaide's ambiguous origins and continental education made her other in a way that could attract fascination and suspicion. She was not simply a widow. She was a widow whose life did not fit easily into local assumptions. Her composure was remarked upon. In inquest rooms, composure can be interpreted as strength, shock, restraint, or emotional withholding. Observers often choose the interpretation that matches their existing suspicion. Adelaide did not collapse publicly. She did not perform grief in the manner some expected. That fact was repeatedly emphasized in press reporting because it fit the emerging enigmatic woman narrative. But a narrative is not a fact. The inquest could not convict on a woman's facial expression. It could only record her answers. Those answers included details that later took on heavier weight: the marriage's unusual structure, the lack of children, the separate bedrooms, and the claim that marital relations ceased early. Whether every detail was accepted by observers mattered less than the fact that these matters were now publicly named. Once named, they became tools. For some, the absence of ordinary marital intimacy suggested Adelaide had motive, escape from a marriage that was privately not satisfying. For others, the absence suggested something else, that the relationship was not the kind that would provoke the ordinary passions associated with jealousy or rage, therefore reducing motive. The same domestic fact could be argued both ways. The inquest did not settle the interpretation. It merely exposed the fact. Dyson and moral fuel. Dyson's inquest position was structurally dangerous because it turned his profession from protection into provocation. As a minister, he could be framed as moral guide. Once chloroform entered the record, he could be framed as hypocrite, seducer, or collaborator. The inquest explored his role, why he visited, how often, what he did, and how he related to Adelaide. Victorian investigations sometimes used moral framing to push witnesses toward confession or contradiction. Dyson's answers, whatever they were received through a moral lens even if the questions were ostensibly factual. The press amplified the moral framing. Newspapers did not merely report, Dyson visited. They reported implication, Dyson visited often. They reported tone, Dyson was close. They treated intimacy as motive and motive as near proof. This is how public opinion in Victorian London could harden rapidly, even while official proceedings remained uncertain. The inquest therefore operated under an atmosphere where the public had already chosen a story: wife and minister, husband inconvenient, poison discovered. The coroner's room was not immune to that atmosphere. The chloroform debate in microcosm. Medical evidence at inquest stage often sets the boundaries for what can be argued later. In the Bartlett case, medical evidence did not set a boundary, it set a conflict. Expert witnesses described the chloroform finding and explained its lethality. The central dispute emerged quickly, whether the absence of burns or irritation in Edwin's mouth and throat ruled out swallowing. One camp leaned toward certainty: chloroform is caustic, swallowing should leave signs, therefore the substance must have entered by some other route. Another camp leaned toward caution: tissue response varies, post-mortem changes complicate appearance, and absence of visible injury does not absolutely eliminate swallowing. The inquest could not resolve which camp was correct. It could record both. It could note the contradiction and the lack of consensus. But the existence of a contradiction was enough to keep the case alive as suspicious. Suspicion is not enough for conviction. It is enough to justify a trial. Purchases, chemists, and the problem of ordinary access. The inquest examined where chloroform could have come from. Victorian chemical access complicates this question. Chloroform was obtainable through chemists. It was used medically. It could be acquired without the kind of clandestine behaviour that would later look incriminating. This made the purchase trail less dramatic and less decisive. A bottle could be bought under innocent pretext. A chemist might not remember the specific transaction. Records might not be detailed. Servants might have purchased items on behalf of the household. Even when a purchase could be established, it did not automatically prove intent. The inquest therefore struggled to anchor the case in a single smoking gun purchase. Instead, it accumulated fragments: household remedies, possible sources, and the general fact that chloroform was obtainable. In many poison cases, the inability to prove a decisive purchase is fatal to prosecution. In the Bartlett case, the prosecution did not rely solely on purchase. It relied on totality, access, domestic irregularity, and the medical anomaly. From inquest to charge. The coroner's task was not to decide guilt. It was to decide whether there was sufficient cause to suspect unlawful killing and therefore send the matter forward for criminal prosecution. Given the presence of chloroform in lethal quantity, it was difficult for the inquest to conclude natural death. Even if method was unclear, the poison's presence demanded further legal scrutiny. The inquest therefore functioned as the doorway from private tragedy to public accusation. By the time the inquest concluded, the Bartlett household's private life had been transformed into a public record of irregularities and access patterns. Adelaide's marriage was no longer merely a marriage, it was context for motive. Dyson's visits were no longer merely tutoring, they were potential collaboration. The lodgings move was no longer merely nursing, it was potential seclusion. These transformations were not proof. They were the raw material of a prosecution. Chapter 8, The Old Bailey, Proof, Scandal, and Scientific Fog, April 1886. The Old Bailey did not inherit a clean case. It inherited a body with chloroform in the stomach and a set of circumstances that looked to the public like the outline of a domestic poisoning. What it did not inherit was a demonstrated method. That absence shaped everything. In a Victorian murder prosecution, motive could be argued through scandal and circumstance, but method had to be coherent enough for the jury to accept that the accused could have done what the Crown alleged. In the Bartlett case, the Crown was required to build a bridge over scientific uncertainty using the materials of household life. The courtroom itself was an instrument. It reduced complexity into forms that could be argued. It turned private conduct into questions asked aloud. It forced witnesses to compress months of domestic life into statements measured in minutes. In doing so, it created a narrative that would endure long after the verdict, because the trial transcript became the most authoritative version of events available to later readers, even though the transcript recorded not everything that happened, but everything that was asked, answered, and permitted. Adelaide Bartlett was not tried in isolation. She was tried inside a theatre of Victorian expectation. A middle-class English jury in 1886 did not enter the courtroom as blank slate. The jurors were men shaped by assumptions about wives, husbands, ministers, and sexuality. They knew the social scripts. They also knew the moral anxieties of the era: fear of female deception, fear of religious hypocrisy, fascination with the foreign woman whose origins were uncertain. These assumptions did not replace evidence, but they influenced how evidence was emotionally received. The Crown's task was to direct those assumptions toward conviction without relying on them openly. The prosecution's narrative. The prosecution framed the case as a domestic poisoning facilitated by control and motivated by improper attachment. Edwin was ill and dependent. Adelaide managed his care and had opportunity. Dyson was close to Adelaide and represented motive. Chloroform was found in Edwin's stomach in lethal quantity. Therefore Edwin had been unlawfully poisoned, and Adelaide was responsible. This narrative had intuitive force. It was the kind of story the public could follow. It took the household's irregularities and arranged them into a motive line. It took Adelaide's nursing role and arranged it into access. It took Dyson's presence and arranged it into emotional incentive. The narrative's weakness was that it did not, by itself, solve the chloroform anomaly. It told the jury why Adelaide might poison Edwin. It did not demonstrate exactly how she could have introduced chloroform into his stomach in a way that matched the post-mortem findings. To strengthen this, the prosecution emphasized totality. In poison cases, totality is often used to compensate for technical gaps. If no single fact proves guilt, the Crown invites the jury to view the facts as a pattern that points in one direction. The defense's task was to dismantle pattern by showing alternative directions remained plausible. Adelaide's marriage as evidence. The Crown presented the Bartlett marriage not simply as background, but as a structure that made motive plausible. The lack of children, the separate bedrooms, and the alleged cessation of marital relations became part of the case's moral architecture. In a Victorian courtroom, unusual marital arrangements were treated as evidence of disorder even when disorder could not be proved. A marriage that did not match expectation was easier to cast as unhappy. Yet the defense could argue the opposite, that Edwin was devoted, that he provided for Adelaide, that the household maintained respectability for years, and that an unconventional arrangement is not the same as murderous conflict. A marriage can be strange and still be stable. It can be unusual and still be mutually accepted. This is where Victorian expectation and legal proof collided. The prosecution wanted irregularity to feel like motive. The defense wanted irregularity to remain merely irregularity. Dyson as unofficial co-defendant. Even though Adelaide was on trial, Dyson's shadow was everywhere. The Crown did not need to put him in the dock to use him. His presence allowed the prosecution to suggest an emotional story, an attachment that would become free only if Edwin died. That story had immediate cultural power because it invoked adultery, betrayal, and religious hypocrisy. The problem for the Crown was that such a story, without proof of act, could look like moral theatrics. A jury might be disgusted by impropriety and still refuse to convict if the Crown could not prove administration. The defense therefore treated Dyson emphasis as a diversion. If the Crown lingered on scandal, the defense could say, without needing to defend Dyson's virtue, that scandal was being used to cover scientific absence. This was a strong defense posture in Victorian courts: remind the jury that moral suspicion is not evidence. Nonetheless, Dyson's closeness remained relevant because it altered the way Adelaide was perceived. A woman accused of poisoning with a minister hovering near her story became easier for a hostile public to imagine as deceitful. Perception is not proof, but trials are fought in perception as well as logic. The evidence of access. The Crown called witnesses to establish who had the practical opportunity to administer substances. Servants and household associates described Adelaide's role as organizer. They described the nursing routine. They described the move to Pimlico. The prosecution's aim was to show that if chloroform entered Edwin's stomach while he was ill and dependent, the person most able to introduce it without resistance or suspicion was Adelaide. This is where poison cases often succeed. Opportunity can be overwhelming when combined with motive. But opportunity can also be universal in households. A caregiver's opportunity is inherent. If opportunity alone were enough, every caregiver would be suspect in every anomalous death. The Bartlett case required more. Medical testimony as battleground. The trial's defining feature was medical conflict. Experts testified about chloroform's lethal effects and about its expected impact on tissues. The central question was pressed repeatedly: could Edwin have swallowed chloroform without visible injury? If not, what alternative route existed? The jury was being asked to choose between competing scientific narratives at a time when forensic science lacked modern standardization. The defense could exploit disagreement simply by presenting it clearly. If doctors cannot agree, the Crown cannot meet the burden of proof. The prosecution, in turn, attempted to persuade the jury that the medical anomaly did not create doubt about poisoning itself, only about the precise method, and that method uncertainty should not prevent conviction if the overall circumstances pointed strongly toward Adelaide. This is where the law's structure becomes unforgiving. Method uncertainty is not a small detail when the case depends on poisoning rather than on a witnessed act. If jurors cannot understand how the poison entered, they may hesitate to declare they are sure who did it. The problem of administration. The most damaging feature for the Crown was the lack of a single coherent mechanism that could be stated without speculation. If chloroform was swallowed, why no burns? If it was introduced while Edwin was unconscious, how was unconsciousness achieved? If it was mixed with something, how did it remain in a form that killed and still leave no clear tissue evidence? If it was forced, why no struggle and why no disorder? Each possibility created a counterquestion, and each counterquestion created room for doubt. In many trials, a prosecution can rely on the idea that jurors do not need to know every detail. But in poison cases, details are the case. The act is invisible. The body is the witness. If the body's evidence cannot be translated into a clear story, the jury is left with suspicion rather than certainty. The defense strategy. The defense did not need to prove Adelaide innocent in a positive sense. It needed to show that the Crown's narrative was not the only reasonable explanation consistent with the evidence. This could be done through several routes. Emphasizing that chloroform could have been obtained and used for medical purposes. Suggesting the possibility of self-administration or accidental ingestion. Highlighting the uncertainty and disagreement among medical experts. Attacking the prosecution's reliance on moral insinuation and scandal. Pointing out that opportunity is inherent in caregiving and not proof of crime. The strongest defense weapon was the scientific fog. The more the jury felt the science was unsettled, the more difficult it became to convict. The courtroom's emotional undercurrent. While lawyers argued proof, the courtroom audience consumed story. Adelaide's demeanor was watched relentlessly. Some observers described her calmness as unnatural. Others described it as controlled restraint. The press turned this observation into a feature of the case. But demeanor does not deliver mechanism. A woman can be calm and guilty. A woman can be calm and innocent. The law knows this, in theory. In practice, juries are human. They interpret behaviour through cultural expectation. In the Bartlett case, the emotional undercurrent mattered because the evidence itself did not resolve cleanly. When evidence is uncertain, jurors may unconsciously reach for emotional cues. The defense would have wanted to prevent this by keeping the jury anchored to doubt. Toward the verdict. As the trial closed, the Crown faced a structural problem. It had a death that looked chemically unnatural, but it could not demonstrate an administration route with confidence. It could show Adelaide had opportunity. It could suggest motive through Dyson and marital irregularity. But it could not close the gap between could have and must have. The jury would decide whether that gap was too wide. Chapter 9, Acquittal and Aftershock, What the Verdict Could Not Fix. When the jury acquitted Adelaide Bartlett, it was not delivering an answer to the public's most urgent question. It was delivering a statement about proof. A verdict of not guilty does not mean nothing happened. It means the Crown did not meet the burden required to punish. In the Bartlett case, this distinction mattered because the evidence left two things standing at the same time: a death with chloroform in the stomach, and a failure to demonstrate a coherent method of administration attributable to Adelaide beyond reasonable doubt. The acquittal resolved the legal question. It did not resolve the case. The courtroom's decision released Adelaide from the threat of the gallows, but it did not restore her to an ordinary life. In Victorian London, a woman accused of murdering her husband with poison, even acquitted, did not step back into society as though the trial were merely a strange interruption. She carried the mark of the accusation, and the accusation was amplified by the themes Victorian society found most intoxicating: sexual irregularity, religious hypocrisy, the foreign woman with uncertain origins, the quiet wife who did not perform grief in the manner expected. If the law required proof, the public required only discomfort. The immediate aftershock. The days after a high-profile trial are not quiet. The verdict becomes raw material. Newspapers present it as vindication or failure depending on their editorial appetite. Commentators frame it as an example of justice or an example of law's limitations. The audience does not disperse with closure. It disperses with argument. In the Bartlett case, two competing interpretations formed immediately. The acquittal proves Adelaide was innocent, and the case demonstrates the danger of scandal-driven prosecution. The acquittal proves only that the case could not be proved, and the case demonstrates how guilt can escape when science cannot demonstrate method. Both interpretations could coexist because the record supported neither as certainty. The chloroform remained. The missing pathway remained. The jury's doubt remained. Adelaide's demeanor continued to be discussed as though it were evidence. People who wanted her guilty saw calmness as coldness. People who wanted her innocent saw calmness as discipline. The same face became a mirror for the observer's preference. This continued attention to demeanor illustrates the public's hunger to convert emotional impressions into legal conclusions the court would not supply. Dyson's social ruin. George Dyson emerged from the trial in an ambiguous legal position but a damaged social one. Victorian society often punished perceived moral irregularity more efficiently than courts punished crime. A minister's authority depended on trust. Once his name was attached to insinuation of improper intimacy, that trust was compromised. Even if no adultery was proved, Dyson's closeness to Adelaide had been aired publicly, and the public airing was enough. It is one of the reasons the Bartlett case persisted. Dyson's role remained unresolved in the same way the chloroform mechanism remained unresolved. If the minister was merely a tutor and spiritual advisor, the scandal was unjust. If he was more, the scandal felt like explanation. Without proof, society filled the gap with suspicion. A minister who loses standing often moves. Movement, later, is interpreted as flight. In reality, it can be simple necessity. A man associated with scandal is often forced out of his community not by law but by discomfort. Discomfort is a powerful exile force. Adelaide's position after trial. For Adelaide, acquittal did not mean freedom from scrutiny. It meant the scrutiny could no longer kill her legally, but it could still erase her socially. Her options were limited in practice. Remain in the same social environment and accept persistent whispering. Retreat into private life and minimize visibility. Relocate and attempt reinvention under new conditions. Reinvention was something Adelaide had already practiced. She had moved from ambiguous origins into the security of English respectability. After the trial, she likely understood that public memory in London would not soften quickly. A woman's name in a murder case was not easily forgotten. Even when forgotten, it was often remembered in fragments: that woman, that case, the chloroform trial. In such circumstances, disappearance is not an admission. It is a strategy. The record of Adelaide's later life becomes thinner partly for that reason. Lives lived under reduced public visibility leave fewer traces. That thinness later becomes part of the case's mythology. People treat absence as mystery, and mystery as concealment. In reality, absence can be ordinary. A person who wants to stop being discussed stops being visible. Edwin's estate and the search for motive. After acquittal, public attention often shifts to money because money offers a motive that feels tangible. If the public cannot get method, it tries to get reason. Financial benefit is easily measured and easily resented. Edwin Bartlett's prosperity meant estate questions were inevitable. What did Adelaide receive? What arrangements existed? What promises were made? In many Victorian cases, an inheritance narrative becomes the most persistent part of the story even when it is not the most relevant. This is because money is legible. The public understands it instinctively. Medical uncertainty is harder to grasp. But in the Bartlett case, money did not deliver a clean motive story strong enough to satisfy everyone. Even if Adelaide benefited, most wives benefited from husbands' estates. Benefit alone cannot explain method. It can only provide incentive. Without method, incentive remains speculative. The case becomes a cultural object. Once the trial ended, the Bartlett case moved from legal proceeding to cultural object. It became something used to illustrate arguments about women and deception, about religion and hypocrisy, about the limitations of forensic medicine, about the risk of moral panic in prosecution, about reasonable doubt as protection or as failure. Cases that remain unresolved in mechanism are especially valuable as cultural objects because they can be reinterpreted endlessly. Each generation can claim the case as evidence for its own concern. The Bartlett case became such a case almost immediately, because it did not end cleanly. Why the verdict did not close the story. A verdict closes a file. It does not necessarily close the mind. The Bartlett case refused closure for structural reasons. The post-mortem finding implied poison. The pathway evidence did not align with ordinary ingestion. The Crown could not demonstrate a single convincing method. The household's irregularities supplied motive narratives that felt plausible. The acquittal left a gap the public filled with speculation. This gap is the engine of enduring true crime. People return to the same question because it cannot be settled. They argue not only about Adelaide's guilt but about what should have happened. Should the jury have convicted on circumstance? Should science have been more certain? Should the law be allowed to let a suspicious person go free? The Bartlett case forces the uncomfortable answer. The law is designed to prefer acquitting the possibly guilty over convicting the possibly innocent. When science cannot close gaps, the law does not permit the jury to close them with moral certainty alone. That principle saved Adelaide. It also condemned her to a different kind of punishment, permanent notoriety. The transition into legacy. After the trial, the case entered its long afterlife. Adelaide became a figure written and rewritten. Dyson became an unresolved shadow. Edwin became a dead man forever associated with chloroform and private marital strangeness. The case became a set of symbols: the quiet wife, the minister, the poisoned stomach, the missing Burns. Chapter 10, Afterlives, Disappearance, Reinvention, and the Case That Wouldn't Die. After the Old Bailey emptied and the public stopped gathering at the courthouse steps, the Bartlett case did not end. It changed form. It moved from sworn testimony to rumor, from medical debate to moral fable, from one newspaper cycle to the next. A murder trial can end in a verdict. A mystery survives on what a verdict cannot supply. The Bartlett case survived because it left behind an unanswered how. In the weeks after Adelaide's acquittal, the practical consequences were immediate. The law no longer had power to punish her for Edwin's death, but society retained the power to isolate. Victorian London was vast, yet its respectable circles were small and tightly linked. A scandal could follow a woman across neighborhood boundaries faster than she could walk. People who had attended the trial carried their impressions back into parlors and clubs. Newspapers carried them farther. A name attached to a poisoning case did not easily return to normal usage. For a woman in Adelaide's position, normal usage was the only real currency. Adelaide's vanishing act. Adelaide's later life is difficult to track cleanly because she had strong reasons to reduce visibility. In a modern context, it can feel suspicious when a person disappears after acquittal. In the 19th century, it was often practical. A woman without the protection of powerful kin could not force society to rehabilitate her reputation. She could only move away from where her reputation was already fixed. Reinvention was not always dramatic. It did not necessarily involve false names or theatrical escape. It could be as simple as relocation, quieter presentation, fewer social engagements, and the careful avoidance of press. Even small distance could reduce recognition. Over time, the public's attention shifted to the next scandal. But the record of Adelaide's day-to-day life after trial remains thin, which allowed later writers to treat her as a permanent enigma. Thin record becomes myth material. True crime history is full of this pattern. The less verifiable information exists about a person's later life, the easier it is for storytellers to suggest they must have been hiding something. The reality is often less satisfying. A woman with every reason to seek privacy did so, and privacy worked. Dyson's compromised future. George Dyson's position after the case was socially precarious in a different way. Adelaide could, in theory, retreat into anonymity. Dyson's professional identity depended on community trust. A minister is sustained by reputation and by the willingness of people to accept him as moral authority. A scandal of this type did not have to be proved true to break that authority. It only had to linger. If Dyson continued in ministry, he would have done so under a stain. If he left ministry, he would have confirmed the public suspicion in the eyes of many observers, regardless of whether he had any moral reason to leave. Victorian society often interpreted a compromised man's retreat as confession. It rarely considered that retreat could be forced by practical survival. The historical record that survives about Dyson's later movements is fragmented and sometimes contradictory. That fragmentation has been used by later commentators to argue for or against his involvement. But fragmentation itself proves nothing. It proves only that the case's notoriety outlasted its official documentation. Edwin Bartlett's legacy, a dead man as exhibit. Edwin Bartlett's life after death existed only in documents and in memory. Like many victims in poisoning cases, he was transformed from person into function. In court, he became the sick husband whose death created suspicion. In the press, he became the devoted man betrayed, or the odd man who tolerated strange arrangements. In later writing, he became the body at the center of a medical riddle. The actual Edwin, his temperament, his private doubts, his daily habits, was flattened into roles. This flattening is common in true crime, because victims are often reduced to how they serve the case's narrative. The Bartlett case did this particularly aggressively because Edwin's own behaviour was part of the mystery. His tolerance of Dyson, his devotion to Adelaide, and his acceptance of private marital arrangements all fed competing interpretations. In one telling, Edwin was a gentle man who trusted too much. In another, he was controlling and peculiar. In another, he was a sick man whose dependence made him vulnerable. All three can be partially true, and none can be proved in full. The chloroform enigma as legacy engine. The case's endurance rests on the post-mortem contradiction. Without it, the story might have faded as another Victorian domestic tragedy. With it, the story became a permanent reference point in discussions of forensic limitation and legal doubt. Chloroform in the stomach, lethal quantity. No corresponding injury in the throat and mouth, as many doctors expected. This forced a question that Victorian science could not comfortably answer. Can chloroform be ingested without leaving visible injury? If not, how else can it end up in the stomach? The inability to answer cleanly meant the trial became less about what was most likely and more about what could be proved. That distinction is the heartbeat of the case's legacy. It makes the Bartlett trial a case study in reasonable doubt. The jury was confronted with compelling suspicion but insufficient certainty in mechanism. For later writers, this uncertainty became a playground. A writer can propose an ingenious method and claim the jury was wrong. Another writer can argue that the medical assumptions about burns were flawed and that accidental or self-administration remained plausible. Another writer can argue the case demonstrates misogynistic moral panic. Each writer uses the same core fact, the unresolved how, to support a different conclusion. Because the how never settled, the who never settled either. How Victorian morality filled scientific gaps. A key feature of the Bartlett case's afterlife is the way moral interpretation attached itself to forensic uncertainty. Victorian society was primed to see certain narratives as plausible: the unfaithful wife, the fallen minister, the unnatural marriage. These narratives had cultural power independent of evidence. When science produced uncertainty, moral expectation stepped in to supply meaning. This is why Adelaide's composure mattered so much to observers. It is why Dyson's profession mattered so much. It is why childlessness and separate bedrooms mattered so much. The public used these facts to build the story it wanted, rather than the story the evidence could fully support. This is not unique to Victorian England. It is the permanent pattern of sensational cases. People reach for the explanation that feels emotionally complete, even when the record remains incomplete. The case as a template. Over time, Adelaide Bartlett became a template figure in true crime history, the acquitted woman whose story continues because it refuses to be settled. The Bartlett case has been referenced alongside other notorious poison cases, not because it produced a clear lesson in method, but because it produced a clear lesson in uncertainty. It illustrates how domestic irregularity becomes motive in public imagination, how access becomes suspicion when method is unclear, how expert disagreement can defeat prosecution, how acquittal can still destroy social life, how the press sustains a case long after law ends. The Bartlett case therefore belongs less to the category of solved crime, and more to the category of enduring legal and forensic puzzle. Its legacy is not closure. Its legacy is argument. Closing the reconstructed narrative. A reconstructed narrative is not a solved narrative. The goal is not to pretend certainty exists. The goal is to hold the facts together without forcing the record to say what it cannot say. Edwin Bartlett died in Pimlico, in a rented room intended for nursing and quiet. Chloroform was found in his stomach in lethal quantity. The pathway question could not be resolved to the satisfaction of the court. Adelaide Bartlett was tried and acquitted. George Dyson was socially implicated regardless of legal outcome. The marriage's private rules, once exposed, became fuel for moral and sensational interpretation. The case endured because it could not be made to end neatly. Epilogue: reasonable doubt. The body yielded chloroform. That fact has never been in dispute. Thomas Edwin Bartlett died in a rented room in Pimlico on the first day of 1886. When his body was examined, chloroform was found in his stomach in a quantity described as sufficient to cause death. The discovery transformed a private sickroom into a public inquiry. It carried the force of chemistry. It demanded explanation. Yet explanation did not arrive in a form the law could use. The prosecution argued that chloroform in the stomach meant administration. Administration required a hand. The most obvious hand belonged to the wife who nursed him. A motive narrative was supplied through the presence of George Dyson. A domestic irregularity was supplied through the structure of the Bartlett marriage. A private world was unfolded into public suspicion. But the case never crossed the final threshold. The difficulty lay not in detecting the substance, but in demonstrating how it entered the body. Medical experts disagreed about the implications of the post-mortem findings. Some insisted that ingestion would necessarily produce visible injury in the mouth and throat. Others cautioned that absence of dramatic injury did not eliminate the possibility of swallowing. No alternative method of administration could be demonstrated with clarity sufficient to silence dispute. The law requires more than suspicion. It requires proof that persuades beyond reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is not a technicality. It is a boundary. It exists to prevent punishment based on probability alone. It demands that jurors be sure, not that they feel strongly, not that they suspect, not that a story fits cultural expectation, but that the evidence closes the gap between likely and proved. In April 1886, the jury in the Central Criminal Court concluded that the gap remained. Their verdict did not declare Adelaide Bartlett innocent in the absolute sense history sometimes seeks. It declared that the Crown had not demonstrated her guilt to the required standard. That distinction is critical. The verdict closed the prosecution. It did not extinguish public argument. The Bartlett case endures because it sits precisely on the line reasonable doubt was designed to draw. The chemical finding feels definitive. The mechanism feels elusive. The domestic context feels suggestive. The legal conclusion feels unsatisfying to those who equate suspicion with certainty. But the alternative would be more unsettling. Had the jury convicted without resolving the pathway of administration, the case would stand today as an example of law yielding to narrative. Instead, it stands as an example of restraint. The court acknowledged that something was wrong, but it refused to substitute conjecture for demonstration. In the years that followed, Adelaide Bartlett withdrew from public life. George Dyson carried the weight of implication. Edwin Bartlett remained a name attached to a toxicological puzzle. The room at Claverton Street became a permanent fixture in the literature of unsolved Victorian crimes. What survives is not a confession, nor a definitive forensic model, nor a universally accepted motive. What survives is a boundary, the insistence that proof must outrun suspicion. The chloroform in Edwin Bartlett's stomach established that his death was not ordinary. The failure to establish how it entered ensured that his death would never be legally resolved beyond the verdict already given. And so the case remains where the jury left it, not proved, not explained, but bound by the principle that doubt, when reasonable, must prevail. Appendix A, Timeline Reconstruction. A poisoning case lives or dies on sequence. The Bartlett case resisted sequence because the household was private, the final setting was temporary, and the key forensic detail created uncertainty rather than clarity. What follows is a practical timeline intended to keep the case anchored to actions rather than commentary. Where the record does not support precision, the uncertainty is stated. 1855. Adelaide Blanche de la Tremouille is born in France. Her parentage is widely believed to connect to French aristocracy through Adolphe Collot de la Tremouille, though documentation is partial. Her mother is Clara Chamberlain, English. 1870s. Adelaide is educated to a standard above that typical for a middle-class English girl, likely through patronage. She moves to England and lives with maternal relatives in Kingston-upon-Thames, where she is positioned as marriageable and respectable. 1875 to 1876. Adelaide meets Thomas Edwin Bartlett, a prosperous grocer in South London. Courtship proceeds under conventional forms. They marry in 1876. 1876 to 1878. The early marriage is marked by physical and domestic separation. Adelaide undertakes extended education and finishing, first in an English boarding arrangement, later in Belgium. Adelaide later asserts the marriage was consummated once for conception. Pregnancy ends in miscarriage or stillbirth, sexual relations cease. 1878 onward. Adelaide returns to live with Edwin, above or near his business interests. The household is respectable and socially active. There are no children. Separate bedrooms persist as a private arrangement. Early to mid-1880s. Edwin experiences recurring gastric complaints. The household begins operating under increasing medical routine, remedies, doctor visits, and nursing patterns. 1885. George Dyson, a Wesleyan minister and tutor, becomes a regular presence in the Bartlett household, introduced as an educational and moral companion. His frequency of visits and private access to Adelaide later becomes central to suspicion and press narrative. Edwin's illness worsens across the year. December 1885. Edwin's condition deteriorates significantly. Nursing intensifies. Household control concentrates around Adelaide as organizer and gatekeeper. A decision is made to relocate Edwin for quieter nursing. Late December 1885. Edwin is moved to rented lodgings at 85 Claverton Street, Pimlico. The environment is temporary and controlled. Witness circle narrows. Remedies and care continue in the lodgings. Night of December 31st, 1885/early January 1st, 1886. Edwin's distress increases. He becomes quiet and then unresponsive. There is no overt sign of violent struggle in the room. A doctor is summoned after he is found dead or beyond recovery. Early narrative aligns with death following illness. Postmortem, January 1886. Medical examination reveals chloroform present in the stomach in lethal quantity. The mouth and throat show none of the expected injury associated with ordinary swallowing. The contradiction becomes the case's center. March 1886. Police investigation and coroner's inquest gather witness testimony, servants, doctors, neighbors, chemists, and household associates. Attention narrows to access, Adelaide as primary nurse and administrator, Dyson as unusually intimate associate, and the circumstances of the move to Pimlico. Press coverage intensifies. April 1886. Trial at the Old Bailey. The Crown attempts to convert circumstance and access into guilt. Defense emphasizes scientific uncertainty and alternative explanations. Expert medical testimony conflicts on the implications of the missing burns and the plausibility of different administration routes. Verdict, April 1886. Adelaide Bartlett is acquitted. Legal process concludes. Public argument continues. Post-trial. Adelaide and Dyson's later movements become harder to trace definitively. The case persists in commentary because the key technical question remains unresolved. Appendix B, the chloroform question. The Bartlett case is remembered because the substance at its center was not exotic. Chloroform was familiar. It was used in medicine. It could be obtained. It was part of the 19th century chemical landscape in a way that made it simultaneously plausible and dangerous. The forensic difficulty was never the simple question, was chloroform present? The difficulty was, how did it get there? Chloroform is volatile. It evaporates quickly. It can leave little trace in a room, especially after time has passed. That characteristic makes it frustrating for investigators who want physical scene evidence. It shifts weight onto internal evidence, what was found in the body. In Edwin Bartlett's case, chloroform was found in the stomach in quantity sufficient to kill. That point pushed the inquiry into a new category. Many poisons leave traces through ingestion. Many leave visible irritation or injury in the mouth, throat, or esophagus. Chloroform, being caustic, was expected to do so if swallowed. The absence of such injury created the contradiction. There are several broad interpretive routes that were debated historically and remain debated in later commentary. They can be set out without forcing a conclusion. Ordinary swallowing occurred, but visible injury did not present. This interpretation treats the absence of burns as non-decisive. It suggests that tissue response may vary, that examination may miss subtle injury, or that the body's condition at death could alter appearance. Under this reading, chloroform could have been swallowed, meaning self-administration and accidental ingestion remain possible in theory. Its weakness is psychological and practical. Chloroform is not pleasant to swallow, and a conscious person would likely experience immediate sensation. It also does not eliminate the question of why it would be swallowed at all in lethal quantity. Chloroform was administered in a way that bypassed or minimized contact injury. This family of explanations includes mechanisms that attempt to deliver chloroform to the stomach without the expected tissue evidence. It is where the case becomes technically speculative because Victorian forensic medicine could not demonstrate such routes convincingly in court. Under this reading, the method might involve disguise, dilution, timing, or delivery while the patient was compromised. Its weakness is legal. A method that cannot be clearly demonstrated can struggle to support conviction, even if it feels plausible. The chloroform finding was real, but interpretation of its pathway was incomplete. This interpretation accepts the chloroform presence and lethal effect but cautions that 19th century understanding of post-mortem appearance and chemical behavior may not map neatly onto a simple must-burn expectation. It frames the case as a clash between evidence and assumption rather than a solved mechanism. Its weakness is emotional. It leaves the mystery intact, which is exactly what the public resisted. Self-administration, deliberate or mistaken. This line of thought argues that Edwin could have taken chloroform himself, either seeking relief, experimenting, or through confusion. It gains traction in cases where method is uncertain because it provides an alternative suspect without requiring a complicated domestic conspiracy. Its weakness is again practical. Lethal chloroform ingestion is not an intuitive act, and the absence of burns was used against ordinary swallowing. Still, the legal system had to consider it, because the defense does not need to prove self-administration, only to preserve reasonable doubt. What the trial ultimately revealed was not the answer, but the boundary of what could be proved in 1886. The court could not convert possibility into certainty. It could not convict on scandal. It could not convict on a method the experts could not confidently explain. That is why Adelaide was acquitted, and why the case remained culturally open long after it was legally closed. Bibliography. Primary sources. British Medical Journal. On the Administration and Dangers of Chloroform. Various issues, 1870 to 1886. Central Criminal Court. R.V. Adelaide Bartlett. Old Bailey Proceedings, April 1886. London. Coroner's Inquest into the Death of Thomas Edwin Bartlett. London, January 1886. Contemporary Reporting and Summaries. The Lancet. Chloroform and Anesthetic Practice. Various issues, 1870 to 1886. The Standard, London. Coverage of the Bartlett Inquest and Trial, January, April 1886. The Times, London. Coverage of the Bartlett Inquest and Trial, January, April 1886. The Daily Telegraph, London. Coverage of the Bartlett Case, 1886. Secondary sources. Burney, Ian A. Poison, Detection and the Victorian Imagination. Manchester, Manchester University Press, 2006. Chambers, Paul. Bodies in the Bookshop, The History of the London Coroner. Stroud, Sutton Publishing, 2006. Clark, Michael, and Catherine Crawford, eds Legal Medicine in History. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1994. Fisher, David. Trials of Passion, Crimes in the Name of Love and Madness. London, Robson Books, 1996. Gatrell, V.A.C. The Hanging Tree, Execution and the English People 1770 to 1868. Oxford, Oxford University Press, 1994. Harris, Ruth. Murders and Madness, Medicine, Law and Society in the Fin de siècle. Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1989. Watson, Catherine D. Poisoned Lives, English Poisoners and Their Victims. London, Hambledon Continuum, 2004. Weiner, Martin J. Reconstructing the Criminal, Culture, Law and Policy in England, 1830 to 1914. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1990. Contextual and Cultural Studies. Davidoff, Leonore, and Catherine Hall. Family Fortunes, Men and Women of the English Middle Class 1780 to 1850. London, Routledge, 1987. Flanders, Judith. The Victorian House, Domestic Life from Childbirth to Deathbed. London, Harper Press, 2003. Jackson, Mark. Newborn Child Murder, Women, Illegitimacy and the Courts in 18th and 19th Century England. Manchester, Manchester University Press, 1996. Shapin, Stephen. The Scientific Revolution. Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1996. Smith, F.B. The People's Health 1830 to 1910. London, Croom Helm, 1979.